The particular stillness of a Las Vegas afternoon in August of 1967 had a quality that people who had never experienced desert heat could not accurately imagine from descriptions alone. It was not simply hot, it was weighted. It pressed down on everything with the specific insistence of something that intended to be taken seriously. And Frank Sinatra sat in the air-conditioned quiet of the Sands Hotel's administrative suite on the fourth floor reviewing contracts with the unhurried attention of a man who had learned over the course of a long career that the documents people handed you deserved more scrutiny than the situations in which they handed them typically encouraged. And the suite smelled of cigarette smoke and the particular neutral cleanliness of hotel air conditioning, and there was no sound from the hallway, and Frank Sinatra was alone, except for a glass of water he had not touched and a telephone that had not rung in 40 minutes, which was an unusual condition for a Tuesday afternoon, and one he was finding himself grateful for. What interrupted the quiet was not the telephone but a knock at the suite door, and when Frank Sinatra said, "Come in," the door was opened by a man named Robert Fisk, who was the Sands head of security and who had the specific quality of careful deference that security professionals developed toward the people whose presence they were responsible for maintaining. And Robert said that he was sorry to interrupt, but that there was a situation downstairs in the employee entrance area that he thought Frank Sinatra might want to know about. And Frank Sinatra set down his contracts and asked what the situation was. And Robert explained that a young man had been attempting to leave the hotel through the employee entrance carrying what the security desk had identified as hotel property, specifically a trumpet that belonged to the hotel's house band equipment inventory, and that when security had stopped the young man, he had told them that he had not been stealing the trumpet but had borrowed it, that he was a musician who had been playing informal sessions with the house band during their break times for the past 3 weeks, and that one of the band members had told him he could take the trumpet home to practice because the young man did not own his own instrument, and that this story had checked out with the band member in question, who confirmed he had given the young man permission but had not thought to ask hotel management whether this was acceptable. And Robert said that the situation was not a theft and that the young man had not tried to run or deny anything, but had stood at the security desk for the past 30 minutes calmly explaining himself to anyone who would listen. And Robert had come to Frank Sinatra not because Frank Sinatra's authority was required to resolve the situation, but because something about the young man had made Robert think Frank Sinatra might want to know about him. And Robert, who had been working at the Sands for 7 years and had developed a finely calibrated sense of which situations warranted Frank Sinatra's attention and which did not, had decided this one did. Frank Sinatra put on his jacket and went downstairs with Robert and found the young man sitting on a bench near the employee entrance with the trumpet case open on his lap, not attempting to go anywhere, apparently having decided that sitting still and being transparent was the best available strategy. And the young man's name was Marcus Holloway, and he was 20 years old, and he had grown up in West Las Vegas and had been playing trumpet since he was 13, had taught himself from a borrowed method book and from listening, had never had formal instruction because formal instruction cost money that his family did not have, and he had been coming to the Sands in the evenings for 3 weeks during the slow period between the hotel's early and late shows, when the house band members took their break, and some of them stayed in the rehearsal room and played informally among themselves. And Marcus had found his way into this informal session through a connection whose specifics Frank Sinatra did not ask about because the specifics were less interesting than what had happened once Marcus arrived, which was that the house band members had recognized fairly quickly that the 20-year-old self-taught trumpet player sitting in with them had something that their years of professional training had given some of them and had not given others, which was the specific quality of musical intelligence that made other musicians want to play with you, the quality of listening and responding rather than simply executing. Frank Sinatra sat down on the bench across from Marcus and looked at the trumpet in the case on Marcus's lap and said, "Play something." And Marcus looked at him with the expression that people produced when they had been expecting a reprimand and received an invitation instead. And then Marcus picked up the trumpet and played, right there in the employee entrance area of the Sands Hotel, with the security desk behind him and the August heat visible through the door that led to the parking lot, and Frank Sinatra sitting across from him on a bench. And what Marcus played was something that Frank Sinatra could not identify as a specific composition, was something that had the quality of something being assembled in real time. And it lasted perhaps 90 seconds, and when Marcus stopped, the security guard at the desk had turned around and was watching, and Robert Fisk was watching, and Frank Sinatra sat with his forearms on his knees and said, "Who taught you to do that?" And Marcus said, "Nobody. I just listen and then I try to make what I heard." And Frank Sinatra said, "What do you listen to?" And Marcus named several recordings and several musicians, and the names he chose were not the obvious name, were not the first names that a 20-year-old with self-taught ability typically cited, but were names that suggested he had listened deeply into the recordings rather than simply at their surfaces, had found the specific musicians within the arrangements, and had paid attention to what those musicians were doing rather than to the overall sound of the recording. And Frank Sinatra asked Marcus to play something specific, asked him to play the opening of a Miles Davis recording that Marcus had mentioned. And Marcus played it, and then Frank Sinatra said, "Now play it differently." And Marcus played it again with an entirely different approach. Not worse, just different. And Frank Sinatra said, "Do you understand why the second version works differently than the first?" And Marcus thought for a moment and then explained, in language that was not technical because he did not have the technical vocabulary, but that was precise in the way that direct observation is precise, exactly what he had done differently, and why the different choice produced a different effect. And Frank Sinatra listened to this explanation with the complete attention he reserved for things that were genuinely interesting, and then said, "How much is a trumpet?" And Marcus said he wasn't sure. He had never priced one. The only trumpet he had ever held was borrowed. And Frank Sinatra said, "What would you do with your own instrument?" And Marcus said, "Practice until I was good enough to get paid for it." And Frank Sinatra said, "What makes you think you're not already good enough to get paid for it?" And Marcus looked at him and said, "Because nobody has offered to pay me yet," which was the most direct and accurate answer to that question Frank Sinatra had received in some time. Frank Sinatra stood up and told Robert to give Marcus his contact information, and told Marcus to come to the Sands the following evening and ask for Frank Sinatra's road manager, a man named Jerry, and that Jerry would have something for him. And Marcus said, "What will he have?" And Frank Sinatra said, "A proper instrument and a conversation with someone who can actually teach you." And Marcus said, "I don't need charity," with the specific directness of someone who had decided that a certain kind of pride was worth maintaining, even in a situation where maintaining it complicated things. And Frank Sinatra looked at Marcus and said, "A trumpet is a tool, Marcus. And you paying me back by becoming good enough to make other people want to listen to you is a reasonable transaction. I'm not interested in your gratitude. I'm interested in what you're going to sound like in 3 years if you have what you need to get there." And Marcus was quiet for a moment and then said, "Okay." And Frank Sinatra walked back through the employee entrance and into the air-conditioned interior of the Sand, and returned to the administrative suite and his contracts and his untouched glass of water. Jerry, the road manager, purchased a trumpet the following morning from a music store on Fremont Street and arranged for Marcus Holloway to meet with a trumpet teacher named William Sato, who Frank Sinatra had encountered through a session musician, and who William's colleagues described as the best private instructor in Las Vegas, which was a smaller distinction than the best private instructor in Los Angeles or New York, but was not an insignificant one. And Marcus showed up to the first lesson with William Sato, carrying his new trumpet in the case that had come with it, and spent the first 30 minutes demonstrating to William what he already knew, which William later told Frank Sinatra was the most unusual experience he had had in 30 years of teaching, which was encountering a 20-year-old self-taught player who had arrived at correct solutions to technical problems through pure observation, and who therefore needed to have the technical framework laid under what he already did, rather than having to first undo incorrect habits before correct ones could be developed. Marcus Holloway worked with William Sato for 2 years, and in that time, the combination of his natural musical intelligence and William's systematic instruction produced a player who was ready for professional work at a level significantly beyond what most players achieved in their early 20s. And Frank Sinatra heard Marcus play again in 1969 at a session that a mutual acquaintance had arranged in Los Angeles. and Marcus had walked into the studio with the specific ease of someone who had grown into their abilities, rather than someone still performing their way around the edges of them. And Frank Sinatra had listened to Marcus play through the session, and afterward had said to the session's producer that Marcus was the real thing, which was Frank Sinatra's specific shorthand for a level of genuine musical ability that was not reducible to technique or training or professional experience, but was something that existed in the musician before any of those things were applied to it, and that the technique and training and professional experience had allowed to become fully audible rather than merely suggested. Marcus Holloway went on to work as a session musician in Los Angeles through the 1970s and 1980s, appeared on recordings that reached significant audiences without those audiences knowing his name, which was the condition of session musicianship, and which Marcus had accepted with the equanimity of someone who had long ago decided that the quality of the playing mattered more than the visibility of the player. And he taught trumpet at a community college in Inglewood for 15 years beginning in 1985, and was described by students and colleagues as a teacher of unusual patience and precision, someone who understood how students arrived at wrong answers, and could therefore help them find right ones rather than simply demonstrating correct technique and expecting students to close the gap on their own. Frank Sinatra and Marcus Holloway crossed paths twice after the Los Angeles session in 1969, both times briefly and both times in professional rather than personal contexts. And the thing that had happened in the employee entrance area of the Sands Hotel in August of 1967 was something that neither of them discussed in any public context, and that Marcus mentioned only once in a private conversation with a student who had asked him how he had gotten started. And Marcus had told the story in the stripped-down version that people tell when they want to convey a fact without making it larger than it was, had said that someone had heard him play in an unusual setting and had made a phone call, and the student had asked who the someone was, and Marcus had said it doesn't matter who, what matters is that they listen. And that this was the thing Marcus had taken from the entire sequence of events that August afternoon, not the trumpet and not the lessons and not the professional opportunities that had followed from those things, but the specific fact that someone with somewhere else to be had sat down on a bench in an employee entrance and asked a 20-year-old self-taught trumpet player to play something, and had listened to the playing with complete attention, and had asked a second question based on what the first answer revealed, and had asked a third question based on what the second answer revealed, and had understood from this sequence of questions and answers something that years of practice had not yet made visible to the people Marcus had been playing alongside, and that this kind of listening, the kind that asked questions and waited for real answers, and built each question on the previous answer rather than arriving with conclusions already formed, was the rarest and most useful thing that one person could offer another, and that the trumpet and the lessons were the expression of the listening rather than the point of it, and that the Las Vegas afternoon in August with its impossible wait and its air-conditioned interior and its bench in an employee entrance had contained, briefly and without anyone intending it to, exactly this kind of listening, and that this was what Marcus had been trying to give his students ever since.